The rain hammered the pavement outside the diner. Each drop a tiny explosion in the neon glow of the sign that read Marge's Place. Ethan stood frozen, his sneakers soaked, his heart pounding louder than the storm. He was 17, and the weight of his mother's words, "You're no son of mine," still burned like a fresh wound. Inside, Margaret stared into her coffee, the steam curling like the guilt she couldn't shake. She'd raised Ethan alone in this small Virginia town, where church bells rang louder than reason and tradition was a chain around the heart. When Ethan came out to her 6 months ago, her world tilted. She'd screamed, cried, and sent him away, convinced she was saving his soul. Now, with the diner failing and her life unraveling, she wondered if she'd lost more than just her son. Ethan pushed open the door, the bell jingling like a warning. The diner was nearly empty, save for a trucker nursing a beer in March. The owner, wiping down the counter. Ethan's eyes locked on his mother, sitting in the corner booth. Her face, once soft with bedtime stories, was now a mask of exhaustion and pride. He hadn't seen her since she'd thrown him out, leaving him to couch surf with friends who barely understood him. Tonight, he wasn't here to beg. He was here to survive. "Ethan," Margaret said, her voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of the jukebox. She didn't look up. "What do you want?" He slid into the booth across from her, his backpack thudding against the cracked vinyl seat. "I need a place to stay," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Just for a bit. I'm not asking for forgiveness." Margaret's jaw tightened. Forgiveness was a word she'd wrestled with for months, ever since she'd found the courage to attend a PFLAG meeting in secret. She'd sat in the back, listening to other parents talk about their queer kids, their stories piercing her like shrapnel. She wanted to believe she could change, but pride was a stubborn beast. And now, with the bank threatening to take the house and the diner barely breaking even, survival demanded every ounce of her strength. "You can't just show up," she said, her voice cracking. "Not after everything." Ethan leaned forward, his hazel eyes fierce. "You think I want to be here? I'm out of options. Mom, you made it clear I'm not your family anymore." The words cut deeper than Margaret expected. She remembered the boy who'd clung to her after nightmares, the one she'd taught to tie his shoes. How had it come to this? She'd grown up in a world where being gay was a sin, a choice, a flaw to be fixed. But Ethan wasn't flawed. He was her son, and she'd failed him. Marge approached, her apron stained with years of grease and grit. "You two okay?" she asked, her eyes flicking between them. Marge had known Margaret since high school, had seen her through the divorce, the diner's ups and downs, and now this. She'd also taken Ethan in for a few nights when he had nowhere else to go. "We're fine," Margaret lied, her fingers tightening around the mug. Marge raised an eyebrow but walked away, leaving them to their fragile ceasefire. Ethan unzipped his backpack and pulled out a crumpled flyer for a local youth shelter. "They're full," he said. "I've been sleeping in the park. You know what that's like. Wondering if you'll wake up to a cop or a fist." Margaret's stomach churned. She'd heard rumors about Ethan's situation from church friends, whispers laced with pity and judgment. She'd ignored them, telling herself he'd made his choice. But now, seeing him thin, tired, but still defiant, she couldn't ignore the truth. He was her responsibility, gay or not. "I can't fix the past," she said finally. "But you can stay. One night. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't trust her. Not yet. The diner's clock ticked louder than it should, marking the seconds of their uneasy truce. Outside, the rain slowed, but the storm between them was far from over. Margaret paid for her coffee, leaving a tip she couldn't afford. As they stepped into the damp night, Ethan trailing behind her, she felt the weight of her pride pressing against her chest. She'd built a life on her reputation, her faith, her identity. But survival was a different beast, one that demanded she choose, hold on to her beliefs, or save the only family she had left. They walked in silence toward her small house on the edge of town, the streetlights casting long shadows. Ethan's backpack swayed with each step, a reminder of how little he carried now. Margaret's mind raced. What would the neighbors say? What would the church think? And yet, beneath it all, a quieter voice whispered, "What kind of mother are you if you let him go again?" The house was dark when they arrived, the porch light flickering like Margaret's resolve. She unlocked the door, her hands shaking. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it meant surrendering something he wasn't ready to give. "Get some rest," she said, pointing to the couch. "We'll talk in the morning." Ethan didn't reply. He dropped his bag and sank onto the couch, his body curling into itself. Margaret stood there, watching him, the boy she'd once carried in her arms, now a stranger in her home. She wanted to say anything to bridge the chasm between them, but words felt like glass, sharp and useless. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, the weight of her choices settled heavier. Pride had cost her Ethan once. Now, with the world closing in, bills piling up, the diner on the brink, and her son barely holding on, she had to decide if pride was worth losing him forever. Morning broke through the cracked blinds, casting slanted light across Ethan's sleeping form on the couch. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, brewing coffee, her hands moving on autopilot. The house smelled of stale air and regret, and she couldn't shake the image of Ethan last night, defiant, broken. Hers. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying their fight 6 months ago. Ethan had stood in this very kitchen, his voice trembling as he said, "I'm gay, Mom. I'm still me." She'd exploded, her fear dressed as anger, quoting scripture she barely understood anymore. She'd told him to leave, thinking it would shock him into fixing himself. Instead, she'd broken something neither of them could repair. Ethan stirred, rubbing his eyes. He sat up, his gaze wary as it met hers. "You didn't have to let me stay," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Why did you?" Margaret poured a second mug of coffee and slid it across the counter. "Because you're my son," she said, the words tasting foreign. "And I'm not sure I know what that means anymore." He didn't touch the coffee. Instead, he pulled his backpack closer, like a shield. "Don't act like you've changed. You made it clear what you think of me." The accusation stung, but Margaret didn't flinch. She'd spent months hiding from those words, drowning them in work and prayer. But now, with Ethan here, there was no escape. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix it, but I was wrong." Ethan's eyes narrowed, searching for a lie. He didn't find one, but he didn't soften either. "You don't get to just say that and make it okay. I've been out there, Mom, alone, because of you." The kitchen clock ticked, each second a reminder of the time they'd lost. Margaret wanted to reach for him, to pull him close like when he was small. But the distance between them was a canyon now. Instead, she sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly. "Tell me what it's been like," she said. "I need to know." Ethan hesitated, then spoke. He told her about the nights in the park, the cold seeping into his bones, about the friends who'd let him crash until their parents found out, about the shelter that turned him away, and the strangers who looked at him like he was less than human. His voice was steady, but his hands shook, betraying the weight of it all. Margaret listened, each word a knife. She'd imagined him struggling, but the reality was worse. She'd sent him into a world that didn't want him, armed with nothing but her rejection. I didn't know, she said finally, her voice breaking. I didn't want this for you. Then why? Ethan's voice rose, sharp and raw. Why did you choose your church, your reputation, over me? She had no answer, not one that could undo the past. Instead, she stood and pulled a photo from the Phrygia-faded picture of Ethan at 10, grinning at a county fair, cotton candy smeared on his face. This is who I see when I think of you, she said, sliding it toward him. Not who you love. I just don't know how to let go of what I was taught. Ethan stared at the photo, his expression unreadable. That kid's gone. Mom, you need to figure out if you can handle who I am now. The doorbell rang, shattering the moment. It was Marge, her face grim as she held up a letter. Bank sent this to the diner, she said, handing it to Margaret. It's about the house. Margaret's heart sank as she read the foreclosure notice. The diner's debts had bled into her personal finances, and now the house, her last anchor, was slipping away. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her, his face a mix of concern and distrust. We'll figure it out, she said, more to herself than to him. But the words felt hollow. The diner was her lifeline, and it was failing. The house was her home, and it was at risk. And Ethan, her son, was a stranger she'd pushed away. Marge lingered, her eyes soft with sympathy. You need help, Margie. Let me call my cousin. He's got a friend who might buy into the diner. Keep it afloat. Margaret nodded, too tired to argue. Marge left, promising to return with news. Ethan stood, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. I'm not staying if you're just gonna pretend everything's fine, he said. I need to know you're in this for real. I'm trying, Margaret said, her voice desperate. I don't know how to do this, Ethan, but I'm trying. He didn't respond, just headed for the door. I'll be back tonight, he said. Maybe. As the door closed behind him, Margaret sank into a chair. The foreclosure notice crumpled in her hand. She'd spent her life building walls around her faith, her pride, her heart. Now, with everything crumbling, she had to decide which walls to let fall. The diner was a battlefield of clinking plates and whispered gossip when Margaret arrived that afternoon. Regulars eyed her, their murmurs sharp with speculation about Ethan's return. She ignored them, tying her apron with practiced hands. But the weight of their stares pressed against her. Marge was behind the counter, pouring coffee for a couple of truckers. Talk to my cousin, she said, sliding a plate of fries to a customer. His friend, Tom, is interested. He's coming by tomorrow to check out the books. Margaret nodded, her mind half on Ethan. He hadn't returned by lunch, and every tick of the clock tightened the knot in her chest. She'd spent the morning cleaning the house, as if tidying could fix the chaos inside her. But Ethan's absence was a reminder trust was earned, not demanded. The bell jingled, and a young woman walked in. Lila, a 20-year-old server who'd worked at the diner for 2 years. She was vibrant, with a nose ring and a laugh that filled the room. She was also openly queer, a fact that had once made Margaret uneasy. Now, Lila's presence felt like a lifeline. Hey, Margie, Lila said, tying her apron. Heard Ethan's back. You okay? Margaret hesitated. Lila had been kind to Ethan, sneaking him food when he'd shown up at the diner's back door months ago. He's staying with me, Margaret said. For now? Lila's eyes softened. That's a start. He's a good kid. Just needs someone to see him. The words hit hard. Margaret had seen Ethan as a problem to fix, not a person to understand. She busied herself wiping down tables. But Lila's words lingered. When the lunch rush slowed, Lila leaned against the counter, her voice low. You know, my mom didn't get it at first either. Took her years to come around. But she did. Margaret paused, her rag still on the table. How? How do you accept it? Lila shrugged. You don't accept it. You love them. The rest figures itself out. The simplicity of it stung. Margaret had loved Ethan fiercely, but her love had been tangled in rules and fear. She wanted to ask Lila more, but the bell jingled again, and Ethan walked in. His hoodie was damp from the drizzle, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. Thought you weren't coming back, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. Changed my mind, Ethan said, sliding into a booth. Got any pie? Lila grinned and headed to the kitchen, leaving them alone. Margaret sat across from him, her hands fidgeting. I'm glad you're here, she said. I mean it. Ethan didn't reply, just nodded. Lila returned with a slice of apple pie, setting it down with a wink. On the house, she said, then left to tend to another table. They ate in silence, the pie a small bridge between them. Margaret watched Ethan, noting the way he hunched over the plate, like he was guarding it. She wanted to ask where he'd been, who he'd been with, but she held back. For now, this was enough. That evening, back at the house, Margaret found Ethan sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. She joined him, the silence heavy but not hostile. I went to a meeting, she said finally. Flag. A few months ago. I didn't know what to say, but I listened. Ethan turned to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Why? Because I don't want to lose you, she said. Not again. He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. They sat there, the night stretching around them, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt a spark of hope. It was fragile, flickering like the porch light, but it was there. The next morning, Tom arrived at the diner, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a handshake like a vice. He pored over the books with Marge, his questions sharp but fair. Margaret hovered nearby, her nerves fraying. The diner was her lifeline, and Tom's investment could save it in the house. Ethan showed up around noon, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't sit, just leaned against the counter, watching Tom with a guarded expression. Margaret caught his eye, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. Everything was at stake. Tom finished his review and sat with Margaret and Marge in the back office. It's a risk, he said, his voice gruff but kind. But I like what you've built here. I'm in, provided we make some changes. Modernize the menu. Cut costs. Margaret exhaled, relief flooding her. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. This place, it's all I've got. Tom nodded, then glanced at Ethan, who'd lingered by the door. Your kid's been helping out, I hear. Good to see families sticking together. The words hit Margaret like a punch. Family. She hadn't thought of them that way in months. Ethan's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to hers, searching. She wanted to say something, to bridge the gap, but Tom was already talking about renovations. That afternoon, Ethan helped Lila clear tables, his movements quick and efficient. Margaret watched, her chest tight with a mix of pride and guilt. He was good at this, charming the customers, joking with Lila. He belonged here, in a way she hadn't expected. When the diner closed, Lila invited Ethan to a local youth group meeting for queer teens. It's chill, she said. Just kids like you. Talking. Hanging out. You should come. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Margaret. She nodded, her throat tight. Go, she said. I'll be here when you get back. He left with Lila, and Margaret stayed late, scrubbing the counter until her hands ached. Marge joined her, her voice gentle. You're doing good, Margie. Letting him go tonight. That's a big step. Margaret didn't reply, just kept scrubbing. She was trying, but every step felt like walking on glass. When Ethan returned, his face was lighter, almost hopeful. It was nice, he said, sitting at the counter. They get it. What it's like. Margaret nodded, her heart aching. She wanted to be the one who understood, but she was still learning. I'm glad, she said. Really? They locked up the diner together, the silence between them softer now. As they walked home, Margaret felt the weight of her pride shifting. Not gone, but loosening its grip. She didn't know if she could save the diner, the house, or her son. But for the first time, she believed she could try. Weeks passed, and the diner buzzed with new energy. Tom's investment brought fresh paint, a new menu, and a steady stream of customers. Margaret worked longer hours, her hands calloused but her heart lighter. Ethan stayed, helping out after school, his presence a quiet anchor in her chaotic world. But the house was still at risk. The bank extended the deadline, but the payments loomed like a storm cloud. Margaret hid the worst of it from Ethan, not wanting to burden him. He was opening up, bit by bittling her about the youth group, about a boy named Sam who made him laugh. She listened, forcing herself to smile, even as her old fears whispered. One evening, Ethan brought Sam to the diner. He was 18, lanky with a shy smile and dark curls. Margaret watched them from behind the counter, her heart a tangle of emotions. Sam was polite, helping clear tables, but his hand brushed Ethan's too often for it to be casual. Margaret's instinct was to look away, to cling to her discomfort. Instead, she walked over. Sam, right, she said, extending a hand. I'm Margaret, Ethan's mom. Sam's eyes widened, but he shook her hand. Nice to meet you, ma'am. Ethan talks about you a lot. Ethan flushed, shooting Sam a look. Margaret managed a smile. Hope it's not all bad. They laughed, and for a moment, the diner felt like home again. But that night, as Margaret counted the day's earnings, the numbers didn't add up. The diner was breaking even, but it wasn't enough to save the house. She sat in the dark office, the weight of failure crushing her. Ethan found her there, his silhouette in the doorway. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. She wanted to lie, to protect him, but the truth spilled out. We might lose the house, she said. I don't know how to fix it. Ethan sat across from her, his expression serious. Let me help. I can get a job. Chip in. You're a kid, Margaret said, shaking her head. This isn't your burden. It's ours, he said, his voice firm. You let me back in. Let me do this. Tears pricked her eyes. She'd pushed him away, and yet here he was, offering to carry her weight. She nodded, unable to speak. They sat in silence, the diner's hum a quiet backdrop to their fragile bond. Ethan got a job at a local bookstore, his evenings filled with shelving novels and chatting with customers. The extra money helped, but it was a drop in the bucket. Margaret worked harder, cutting corners at the diner, negotiating with the bank. Every night, she and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, pooling their earnings, planning like a team. But the town wasn't kind. Word spread about Ethan's return, about Sam, about Margaret's softening stance. Church friends stopped coming to the diner, their absence a silent rebuke. One Sunday, a note was slipped under the diner's door. God doesn't love sinners. Margaret crumpled it, her hands shaking with anger and shame. Ethan saw it, his face hardening. They don't know me, he said. They don't know us. Margaret wanted to agree, to be strong for him, but the word stuck. She'd been one of those people once, judging, condemning. Now, she was on the other side, and it was lonelier than she'd imagined. Lila organized a fundraiser at the diner, a queer-friendly open mic night to raise money for the house. Ethan performed a poem, his voice raw and powerful, about love and loss and finding himself. Margaret watched from the back, tears streaming down her face. The crowd cheered, and for the first time, she saw her son as he was brave. Whole. Hers. The fundraiser brought in enough to delay the foreclosure, but not enough to save the house. Margaret lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She'd lost so much: her marriage, her faith, her place in this town. But Ethan was here, and that was worth fighting for. The bank's deadline loomed, a guillotine over their lives. Margaret and Ethan worked tirelessly, but the numbers were merciless. One night, Marge pulled Margaret aside. There's a buyer for the diner, she said. It's a good offer. You could save the house. Margaret's heart sank. The diner was her legacy, her pride. Selling it felt like surrendering. But losing the house meant losing Ethan's stability, their fragile new beginning. She looked at him, laughing with Sam at a booth, and made her choice. She signed the papers the next day, her hands steady but her heart breaking. The diner would stay open under new ownership, but it wouldn't be hers. She told Ethan that night, expecting anger. Instead, he hugged her, his arms tight. You did it for us, he said. That's enough. The house was safe, but the cost was steep. Margaret felt unmoored, her identity tied to a place she no longer owned. Ethan noticed, his concern quiet but constant. He started leaving notes around the house, small things, like, thanks for trying, or we're okay. Each one chipped away at her pride, replacing it with something softer, stronger. One evening, Ethan brought her to the youth group, introducing her to his friends. They were vibrant, resilient, unapologetic. Margaret listened to their stories, her heart opening in ways she hadn't thought possible. She wasn't fixed. Not yet. But she was learning. Spring came, painting the town in soft greens and golds. Margaret and Ethan settled into a new rhythm, their days simpler but fuller. The house was theirs, paid for with the diner's sale and their shared effort. Ethan graduated high school, his cap tilted proudly as Margaret cheered from the crowd. Sam at her side. They still fought. Sometimes old wounds didn't heal overnight, but each argument ended with words, not silence. And that was progress. Margaret joined PFLAG regularly, her voice growing steadier as she shared her story. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying, and Ethan saw it. One Sunday, they walked to the diner, now bustling under new management. Marge greeted them, her smile warm. You did good, Margie, she said, handing them coffee. Both of you. They sat in their old booth, the one where it all began. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm. I'm proud of you, he said, his voice steady, for choosing us. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Pride had been her anchor, her cage. She'd clung to it, thinking it defined her. But here, with Ethan, she realized survival wasn't just about keeping a house or a business. It was about love, messy, painful, transformative. As they left the diner, the sun warm on their faces, Margaret felt lighter. She'd lost her pride, but she'd gained her son. And that, she knew, was worth everything.